Hello. Today we are going to paint this lily pond that you see in front. Um, it's a little complicated only because we have to stay within the shapes, the oval shapes that the lily pads create. But if you draw them out carefully, don't go too detailed, it should look fine at the end. You still want to keep everything looking a little loose and free. So I'm sketching in. I apologize for the light. Um, I was testing out a new light. I think I could have adjusted it a little lower in intensity. Um, I keep my drawing very loose. Here I'm just drawing in the ovals, the larger ones that I see, and the smaller ones that are in the back by the trees. They're really just masses. So you don't really see every individual lily pad. So don't go crazy trying to get every little one, because what'll happen is as you try to delineate um, each small lily pad by cutting in, because you're working in the reverse, meaning you're going to be painting the dark into the light or around the light areas, which are the lily pads. So that can get confusing when they're that small. So try to paint them as masses. And you'll see in the demonstration as we go forward, you'll see that happening there. Yeah, so as you can see, sketch isn't all that detailed. There's enough information there for me to work with. And I think that's probably about it. I'm using 11 by 14 Arches 140-pound cold press paper. I find it to be the best for what I like and how I like to paint. I like to get the dry brushing effects. So I'm starting off with some cerulean blue and ultramarine blue, and I'm actually picking up the clouds. So I'm putting the wash down, but also lifting off the paint to create the cloud shapes, because they were kind of on the misty side. So that's pretty much it. The color that I chose here was a cerulean, and since it's on top of water, there's a little bit of green. You could use ultramarine blue if you don't have cerulean blue. That would be just fine. In fact, if you look at the little inset picture, well, here I'm mixing some color for the lily pads. And I do want to paint those in as masses, right? Now be careful. I waited a little while for that blue to dry, because you don't want the green to seep into the blue if you can help it. If it happens, okay, because we have to go over and do a final wash of a darker value, okay? But we have to cover everything. We have to cover all the green first. And as you can see, I'm just really getting like the lighter green that is on the lily pads. So what's happening here is I'm just trying to get the local and the big average colors. Not really getting any form at this point. It's just covering everything up, so I have these areas completely covered, so that when we go to our second wash, we'll have something to paint into, and you'll see what happens as the video progresses. Now there, I waited. I should have kind of painted that first, but all you have to do is, if you have an area where if the paint's not completely dry, you can always just scrub the brush and just get a softer edge. That's when you stop a wash and then go back to it. That'll dry on you within a few minutes. But usually it's not dry to the point where you can't scrub it to get softer. You'll see my finger pointing to different things. I was actually doing this as a live demonstration at my school, and that's why you'll see me showing the colors. Every once in a while I'll show the palette and the shapes. right? So that's kind of helpful to you guys too. Um, was my drawing exactly the way the picture showed up? Not really. You could you could pretty much change the composition based on what you feel. Now I'm making a darker green. I'm using sap green, ultramarine blue, burnt umber, because I want to start working on the massive trees in the distance. Now they're kind of complex because there are layers, and then we have the trees in the foreground um, that are contrasting dark against the lighter green. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm just trying to create sort of like that chaotic feeling of a dense wooded area by simply adding a lot of color, different values, and here I'm painting in the background. If you can see in the little inset picture, you can see that there are, it's kind of on the blue side. That's to indicate that it's in the distance. And you could use a lighter color, you could use a more muted color, whatever you want to do to get the effect. And here, just darker accents on the bottom, some darker accents in the middle, wherever I feel that it needs something, a value change. And again, it's not really, I'm not looking at any specific point in the photograph. I'm trying to get the impression. So I'm not really, trying to copy every form. Now here I'm painting in probably what's going to be the watercolor inside and around the lily pad. So in order to match up what I had painted earlier, I'm painting in the negative. What does that mean? It means I'm painting around the forms as best I can. Now, this style of painting is what you would probably paint if you were on spot. Like, there's nothing, I didn't paint anything before. There was no prerequisite painting, no study. It's just jumping in and painting. You'll find that sometimes you'll get great results if you just stay loose and try to record what you see as quickly and accurately as you're visualizing, as you're observing the subject matter. So if I was outside sitting on a dock painting this pond, I would paint it the exact same way, direct. Not too much drawing, because what happens is when we overdraw something, get into this mode of feeling that we have to, I kind of call it the coloring book syndrome. You have these really perfect lines and you feel obligated to stay within them. So if your drawing is a little on the loose side, you don't really have these closed, tight drawings to be so obedient to. So that's why I kind of prefer, and a lot of watercolor painters do like painting that way, because they do like the feeling that when they're painting and drawing more with the brush and less with the pencil, right? That will definitely achieve a looser picture. Now, I'm not saying to be messy or not really taking care of what you, as you're visualizing, not making good marks on your paper. You still have to be somewhat accurate, but you don't have to be as detailed, is really what I'm trying to say. So now you can actually see it's starting to take some shape. Now remember, this is basically our first wash. So everything is kind of, we're mapping out a lot of the shapes. I'm going back in certain areas, adding some more color. I felt that this painting needed a little bit more color impact, so I'm using a lot of cerulean, cobalt blue, and ultramarine blue in the shadows. And you'll see at the end of the painting how they still come through. remember now, this is still just the first wash. So I think at this point I'm looking at the trees, the tree shapes, and you'll see that when I put them down, I say, okay, well that looks okay, but then I do start lifting some of those trees up. Now, I thought they just looked a little too stark, too obtrusive. So I just took a paper towel and dabbed a little bit, right? So that little dabbing kind of gives you an atmospheric effect. It gives you a little texture all in one little tap, right? So think about that when you're painting. You don't want the trees to look so stark, and you want them to look like they're broke, the colors are broken up in the forms. So these are some tricks that you can use, and techniques rather, that you can use to make your watercolor look a little bit more natural. And that's what I'm trying to do here. And now there was that little patch, as you can see in the inset, that was a little brighter green. All I did was just go over it with a little wet paper towel, just to lift up some of that color. And now I'm dropping in some of the more intense greens, and painting dark around it so the green jumps out a little bit more. Okay, so here I'm painting just a few little branches and things here. I believe I go back to this again, and you'll see, I think, just to darken it, get it a little bit more, get it a little richer. And so the next step, I believe, is going to be painting the water and starting to bring some of the water shapes and the reflections on the water out a little bit more. Some of the texture in the background, you'll see. I do a little dry brushing on that right side where the water's opened up, just below the tree line in the distance. And yeah, I do go back to that spot and just start adding. Now notice my brush got a little smaller because I am going in for some little detail. You also have to remember too, now when I say detail, it's really just some embellishments here and there. But the reason I use the small brush is because we still have to remember scale in a painting. So the things that are in the far distance, your brush stroke should be a little smaller, in order to get that feeling of depth, right? If your brush strokes were all the same size, your painting would look like they were all on the same plane. There wouldn't be any differentiation between the background and the foreground. So keep that in mind when you paint, that sometimes you do have to get a little smaller in some of your brush strokes. And I'm not saying detail, but the scaling of the brushes should go down when you're painting things in the far distance. Here I'm still using I believe it was a number 6 or number 8. I use the silver black velvet brushes. I think they're great. They're I don't have any stock in the company, but they're really good. They're a half and half mixture of squirrel hair and synthetic, and they really hold up well. I've had these for a few years, and I've abused them, crushed the hair to get tree techniques, and they always bring back the point no matter what. So that's a sign of a good brush. And the ferrules have never loosened up, especially with the watercolor. When I paint, I don't leave my brushes sitting in water. I wash them out and I put them down on a piece of paper towel. That will definitely ruin a brush and the shape quicker than anything else. All right, so dry brushing on the right side. And just to get that little sparkle in the water, there's still some reflections back there that I come back to, just to get a little bit of opening. I left a little bit, like you see in the inset picture, there's a little bit of opening there. And now I'm just really dropping in some value, which is just sap green. Most of the greens that you see are sap green. Now, some might look like, oh, wait, the ones in the back look cooler. Well, they are, and that's where I added cerulean blue. But where they get warmer, I'll add burnt sienna or yellow ochre, depending on the value, to the sap green to get more natural tints of the same color. So when you're working, you don't want to have just one type of green. You want to have many green. I mean, if you've ever looked into a woods, yeah, everything looks green, but if you really observe and take note, you'll see that the way the light hits a cluster of leaves can be very cool or it could be very warm, depending on the light situation. So as you work as an artist, you have to be sensitive to these things, because as you're painting, if you paint everything in one color, you're going to have a very boring painting, or it's going to be it's going to look monochromatic in a sense. So here we can see right now that there's about 3 different types of green in this picture. There's this dark green, which is burnt umber, sap green, and ultramarine blue. That's how I create the depth in that color. And you probably wanted, well, why don't you just use a green that's really dark? Well, I like to control the tint, like the warmth, or I should say the temperature. And I could make my green more cool by adding more ultramarine blue, and I can get it warmer by adding burnt umber or burnt sienna, depending on the value that I want. And I can neutralize the color so that they don't look too, we use the word juvenile, meaning like too overly colored. You know, there's one thing you can, I mean, I'm not against using bright color, but sometimes if you're after like a more naturalistic approach to your painting, if you really study nature, you'll see that, you know, greens are not just one green. It's not like a permanent green or the green that you'd see in most beginner art sets, right? They'll just give you like a generic green, and and then you would just paint anything, well, anything that was green in your paint, and your artwork would, you know, kind of take on a childlike look, because the colors aren't they're not mature, meaning that you're not looking at those nuances like I talked about earlier. So here I'm adding some blues to that green. Um, and you'll see as I progress, more things will start to happen. Now, I just put a little bit of wash on that lower uh, lily pad and the lower right-hand corner. And now I'm just making embellishments. And again, if you look at the inset picture, you'll see that it's not one flat green. You can go richer if you want to. I just wanted to make mine a little bit more airy, so I opened it up a little bit. So my value structure is a little lighter than the photo. I felt that some of the darks in the photo were too dark. They were too photographic. So I'm taking liberties in making my my picture a little lighter. The reason for that is, like, if you were actually there, right, and you were observing these things, the colors that you see from life are so much different than the colors that you see in a photograph. And the more you paint outdoors, the more you'll see that, you know, the sky blue, you know, actually isn't as blue as you think it is. It's not the blue that just comes right out of your tube. It's not ultramarine blue straight out of the tube. I've noticed in my plein air painting that the sky, and depending on the atmosphere, can actually take on a little bit of gray, which is unusual. And you think, oh boy, that must look bad, but like, not really. It actually makes the painting look more natural when it's less intense color. And I know that doesn't sound like how an artist should work, but if you're looking to do naturalism, you have to look at the color, at the temperatures of the colors. You have to look at the neutrality. You know, how intense really are they? You know, and really, you know, be honest with yourself and say, you know what, that blue sky doesn't look all that blue. I mean, I see a little gray in there. And in watercolor, you know, we're working transparently, so we can just simply add more white. I'm sorry, add more water to our washes and get like a lighter version and maybe not as intense. But then we can drop in a tiny bit of whatever complementary color that blue would be. So it could be a tiny bit of brown, which would be a warm. And then you could get this, you can get blue that would be very soft and very realistic. All right, so back to the lily pads. As you can see, I'm adding texture. Some of them I'm adding water, some of them I'm just making marks and then blending them. And how you do that simply is you put a layer down, a wash down, and then you go back over it with a wet a wet brush with no pigment in it at all, and then you can get these slight gradients that you see happening in here. Some of them I felt needed to be darker because I didn't want the brighter ones going right off the page. So you'll see that some of them are a little different than the ones in the photograph. I didn't put that, there's like a tear in one of the lily pads in the foreground. I felt that if I drew that, it would look like some kind of Pac-Man monster. So I left it out. Yeah, so more coloring. And there you go. So I'm just adding white to give it that slight gradation. And now this one, I felt it needed to be a little cooler. So I'm changing the temperatures, right? If anyone doesn't understand what temperature means, it just means if let's say you have a green and the green is cooler, you're going to add more blue to change the temperature from warm to cool, or vice versa. You can warm it up and you can cool it down. Now, what I do is I don't use gray. I'll use the complementary color. So if I wanted to warm up a green, I'll use like a burnt sienna or red, and varying degrees. And that's how you would get more natural color in your painting. Now with watercolor, those of you who have been painting in watercolor for a while, you know that the paint is going to dry lighter. All right, that's just the characteristic of watercolor. So we have, we have that responsibility to know, okay, well, if the color looks good in the first wash, chances are it's wrong because it's going to dry lighter. So we have to foresee those colors. That's why sometimes you'll see a lot of watercolors that look very light and airy and almost too light, because maybe the artist felt like, well, the value structure looks good, I'm going to leave it this way. But you have to, if you really want your paintings to look real and have a full spectrum of value, you have to go as dark as you can. I mean, not black, but you have to go dark in some areas in order to get contrast. And so that's what this painting is really all about. It's really contrasting shapes and just going around them and refining, those little elliptical discs that are the lily pads, right? So that's what we're doing here now. I'm going back with the smaller brush. And again, the smaller brush is used, I'm doing reflections here now from those trees in the distance, and adding more embellishments. I mean, there's actually, you can see, again, if you were standing in front of these lily pads, if there was an embankment there, you would actually see what was under the water. I mean, they could have been, fish swimming under there or whatever. You could have seen, the vines and whatever or the root system from the lily pads would be there. And we do paint them because there are a few that are actually on the surface, and you'll see we'll do that in a little while. So I must have been talking to the class there. And here, going back again, a lot of what you're seeing is just little details. Now here I'm trying to create more contrast by just using little accent marks. right? So I'm going over, and those little things add some interest to the painting. Some water, uh, uh, little touches of cerulean blue, just to give little ripples in the water where you see in the picture. Um, and here, actually, the hand on the lower left-hand corner, I'm actually Googling. I felt that the painting needs some kind of life. So what I did was I found a picture of I think it was an egret flying. So I'm going to actually paint that in at some point, probably about right now. And yes, I do have to use white to create the shapes because, well, the bird is going to contrast against all that green. So, and instead, I'm just painting in the shapes of the bird flying, okay? And that's it. So I mean, I'm gonna be I'm drying it only to go darker in some areas. You can actually see where the stuff I use is called Pro White. It's very, very bright, but it does get kind of soaked into the washes. So I added a little bit of like a tint of like an orangey around the under the wing, and the bill has a little bit of orange. And I think there's little tiny hits of light as accents, like the light coming through the trees. And that's it. That's the bird. And it felt like it needed a little bit more accent marks. And now, while I have the white paint out, I'm going to paint little drips, little dots, just to make the lily pads look like they have a little bit like these little beads of water on them, right? Or bubbles, whatever you want to call them. So now the stems and they kind of, yeah, they grow in a strange way, kind of like on a lateral trajectory, if you will. And that's what I'm trying to draw here. And you see that they go in all different directions, mainly horizontal to the waves. So if you follow that, you're good. They do have like a little curve to them. So keep that in mind. There are some that just kind of flop down, but they kind of add some more interest into all that dark water area. And now I'm going back and I'm adding little bits of light to the lily pads back there. And there are little flowers, like, as you can see in the inset picture. And I got to go back now and try to, in the areas that I left white, and areas that I didn't leave white, I'm going to add these little flower they're tiny little ones in the distance, but they need to be there just to give the painting some context. You wouldn't just have like one flower in the whole area. So so there it is. I'm adding, I don't know what it looks like. If you look at the inset picture, it looks like a fallen tree or something in the swamp there. There's some trees shapes in the back contrasting against the lighter areas. Don't go too crazy. Just indicate a few little things. Like what I'm doing here now is I'm just adding a little bit of, just a few lines here and there, just to give us a feeling that there's some smaller branches on the trees. That's pretty much it. And now I'm adding a little bit of cerulean because I'm seeing little bits of blue that are probably poking through some of the trees. If they look a little too, again, harsh, you can take your finger and pounce on them a little bit, or just give it a little spray of water from a water bottle. And what that'll do is that will keep them from getting too, the shapes to be too hard. You do that with the water too. And let's see. So yeah, trying to define some more shapes in the flower. Now here I am going back with the white because I wasn't crazy about some of the shapes. I felt that they needed to look more like lily pad flowers. So, and the one behind it was kind of contrasting too dark, a light rather, against the little flower. So I deadened that a little bit, set that back.